All right, great. Well, welcome everybody to the end of year eData end of year webinar. There's going to be several items that we'll go over, and just know that the recording and I might also see if we can make this PowerPoint available afterwards as well, so you can have it as sort of checklist of sorts, if you will, as far as going through and being able to use this as a means of checking everything in eData to successfully close out the program year. I think many familiar faces here in the guest list. So welcome back to yet another end of the program year. It's if you're like me, it's hard to believe that we're here already. Just as an order of business, for those of you who may be new, my name is Michael McCarty, and joining us additionally as the other half of the eData tech support team is Steve Linus. It's good to see all of you. What we're going to do today is go through some items of note and what I would say too is these are items of note. They're all important. There are other important things too that we may not mention, but the purpose of today is just to focus really on some of the items that are very important for this time of year in eData. As you, I'm sure, all know, since eData runs from July 1st to June 30th, and then we'll stay open for an additional 2 weeks to capture the data for this program year on to July 15th. We just have some urgency now and some things to keep in mind as we move forward through the rest of the program year. So what we're going to do here is we're going to jump right into some content. And I would just ask if you want to put questions in the chat, that would work really well. Let me open up the chat here so I can kind of see it and monitor it. And so you're welcome to put questions in the chat at any time, but in terms of questions while we're kind of going through, if you would like to unmute, that's okay, but I ask that you wait until we just kind of do a call out for that and ask for questions. That way we kind of keep a good pacing today. All right, so let's jump into the bits and pieces of today's presentation. Let's go to the first slide here. And of course, before we get into eData stuff, there are some of you who may be wondering what's going on with version 3. Well, version 3 of the template is not yet posted on the PA Adult Ed Resources website. We had to take into account some of the new assessment items and some things that we needed to work on. So it took a little longer than we previously announced, but it should be imminent. The changes include reducing the number of queries. We'll provide a list of those queries that we removed and substitute options for those queries. We updated some of the query, well, actually not all, some. Steve went through and updated every single query and or report description. And when we say description, those are the little links that you can click on when you click the query or report name to see exactly what the query or report does. So there are updated, generally speaking, more descriptive descriptions of each of those items that will hopefully help you navigate all of the various queries and reports in the template and know what you're looking at when you run them. And then lastly, bug fixes. You'll see a more detailed accounting of all of these items in the email that we'll send out to you later that will officially announce that version 3 is ready and online. This is the last planned version for this program year. I say planned because if some major bug or something is discovered, we may need to upload 3.1, if you will. But our plan is to have this be the final upload, and that's going to be something to think about in later slides. When we get through this discussion, you'll see how we're going to maybe discuss about how to handle your files for the end of the program year. All right, so end of program year. So why we're all here. We're sitting here, it's June 17th. Within a month, eData will close. And what leads up to that are a few items, and we want to think about July in particular. So the end of the program year through June 30th is going to be business as usual, entering attendance, entering assessments, things that you've all been doing since eData opened for you back in the fall of last year. But now we have a situation that's fast approaching where eData will be closing on July 15th. And before it does, there are a couple things that we want to keep in mind, some related to this program year and some for next. So the first item is on July 1st, on or around, there should be available on the PA Adult Ed Resources website new forms for data collection. It will be important to use those new forms because they do have some changes. For example, if you have family literacy, the intervals for the family income change, that changes every year. So those get updated. There is going to be a new field addition to the sex field for adult records, where there's going to be some new options in addition to what was previously just male and female. There will also be new reason for leaving options. So those are just some highlights. We'll announce those and get those out to you later as we get close to release of those forms. But right now you can just pencil in around July 1st, you'll be able to use the forms. And we do ask that you use those forms moving forward, starting on July 1st when the new program year actually starts. What's confusing, of course, in our data world here is that we've got a data system for what is now, for us sitting here today, the current year, that stays open a few weeks, or a couple weeks rather, into the new year. But while that's happening, you're doing things for the new year, like using the data form. So we're going to kind of talk about things mostly in the perspective of eData, which is going to be the 23-24 program year. But those forms are something to keep in mind because, of course, for now, you're just going to collect those starting July 1st. And then when eData opens for the 24-25 program year in the fall, then you'll, of course, use the data in those forms. And there will be fillable and non-fillable versions for each to support the needs of the ways that your agencies collect data. As you can see in the middle circle, and we'll talk more details about this in coming slides here, but what we have is we have a situation where you're going to have the ability with your 2-week data entry requirement to add data into eData from July 1st to July 15th, even though that is, of course, calendar-wise during the new program or the next program year. But July 15th, close of business, eData will close. After that, no data entry will be possible. But let's get into the details. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of what to think about within these dates. So building on that, we are, of course, going to review end-of-year data entry. We talked about the forms. We will be sending out a July data check report via email, as we always do, the first Monday of the month. This year's might be a little bit early because of some vacation and things. We might actually send it on, I think it's June 28th. So the Friday before the 1st of July. But in any case, the idea is you'll get one more via email data check report from us. You can, of course, run those anytime you want in a populated template locally. And you might wish to do so even after getting the report from us to see how things have been resolved and just check your data check. Also, another thing that's very important, and you'll want version 3 of the template for this for sure, because we made some updates and corrections. The data validation page on the template will help you complete the data validation process. More information on that can be found in division policy, but there are some deadlines pretty shortly after eData closes where you'll need to send some information to the division, and the data validation page in the template will help you fill out those forms. So those are some items that are really going to be on your radar for data for this time of year that are very specific to end of June, early July, transitioning across program years. Specifically prior to July 15th in eData, there's some things to keep in mind. So this is going to focus mostly on just kind of how to manage your data. And the first item here is we want to make sure to add all of your completed 23-24, so this program year's adult intakes into eData. Those are the reportable students. Those are the folks that you may not have had any contact with outside of just having them complete the intake, but that qualifies them per NRS reporting as a reportable student. So it's important to get that information in eData. There's no like penalty, if you will, to putting them in and having 0 hours. The problem would be as if they weren't there in the first place. So get those in to eData. Also, resolve all of your near matches. Many of you have already reached out to me to do that and continue to do so throughout the year. So that's excellent, but do double check those. Again, you can run that data check or not. Actually, I don't know if we put those in the data checks. I think we do, but there's also a button on the main page about resolving near matches, and that's under the adult column. So you can run those, check them, and reach out to us with some information to help us resolve those for you. Also, in addition to near matches, somewhat similar are adult record deletion requests. So on your end, you can't delete adults, but we can. So you typically have to request that. You can mark an adult for deletion, but that doesn't send us a notification or anything active that we would necessarily see and be a call to action for us. So if you have an adult marked for deletion or multiple adults, reach out to us and let us know. We will begin checking those sometime in July, but it would be best, as with everything we're telling you today, to get on top of it as soon as possible, because then if it takes us a little bit of time to resolve it, we'll actually have that time. Deletions is generally require a reason or a purpose to be deleted. If an adult had an intake, as we said before about reportables, they should stay in eData. So usually deletion requests have to do with duplicate entries, mistaken data entry where maybe you put someone in who was a participant last year into this year. At this point in time, probably not going to have many of those. So there really needs to be some kind of justification to delete the adult. So we may actually follow up with you and say, what, your mark for this student for deletion, what's the reason, and take it from there. Also, you're going to hear us say multiple times today, begin thinking about saving a copy of exported data from eData. And when I say that, that's the file that comes out of eData when you do the export that says extractreport.zip. That's the name of the file. And you can rename the file something, as you see in the parentheses here, something like 23, 24 full year data. That would be something that I would do once I was confident that my agency filled out and did all the data entry for the year. And I save this zip file for just safekeeping if you ever need it. In particular, as you see the prompt on the screen before July 15th, that's when it's important to do that, because as you all likely know, after July 15th, if you try to get into eData, you won't have access to any of your information. So that's one of those things that is very important and helpful, because as long as you have a backup, you will be able to function and run reports and do what you need to do. So that would be one of two things we'll tell you to back up. The first is the export from eData. That's all those individual files that go into your data folder. And this in particular would be the zip file that bundles all of those together. So I've thrown out a good bit of information. I'll just take a pause here for a minute and see if there are any questions or comments to this. There's more to come, but any questions or comments so far? You can unmute yourself or put something in the chat. There is a question in the chat. Amy says, is there a report to find students marked for deletion? You should be able to filter in the adult query on the main page. There is, I believe, and Steve, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if you want to just double check that quick. I think in the many fields that exist in the adult query on the main page of the template, there is a yes, no field that says marked for deletion. I think it's literally, it's either true, false, or yes, no. Either way, you could tell the difference. And you could just do a quick filter on that field in the adult table, and that'll bring that up for you.
There is. It's after all the cell phone, work phone.
Yeah. Sometimes the hardest thing on that adult query is just you might know the field is there, but finding it, because there's so many various fields that pretty much everything that defines the adult. But that's a great question, Amy. That way you don't have to try to remember who it was that you marked, but rather just go ahead and do that filter on that table, and that should give you your answers. Last time I checked, there weren't too many, but it's one of the, since it's that time of year, we want to make sure we get those all resolved. Good question. Okay, we don't see any other questions in the chat. So what we'll do here is we'll just keep moving on, but there will be opportunities, more than one opportunity before we finish for more questions. So again, if you want to placeholder a question as you think of it, go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll get to that during the next little break. Next thing, also continuing that theme of prior to July 15th, and also with the theme of saving some items on your computer. Wouldn't be even a bad idea to have multiple staff at your agency do this just in case, because stuff happens with equipment and your computer could go down. So if you're at a larger agency, especially, you have multiple people who have access to an eData export, you might want to save the export, but also, as you see in the first bullet point here, save a copy of the populated template file. If you have a populated template file, it functions more or less just like a Word file or an Excel file, any other file that you could normally open up your computer and just view and look at and use. So eData is not required to be open for the populated template to work, just that you have exported your eData from eData when it was open, and then populate that template. Then you could run those data checks and reports as many times as you need. And this may be necessary, and we'll get into this topic a little more later this afternoon. But this would be really necessary to have that populated template to monitor for certain things going into the new program year while eData is down. So in the end of July, if you have a bunch of new students come to you for an orientation and you want to see, hey, did they attend last year? You may have an internal database that tracks these things. And if you do, you're probably all set. But just in case you don't, or even if you want to verify and double check, you could go into a populated template and run some reports and look for those students, perhaps by class or group that they were in last year. There's lots of different ways you could filter and look for the students. But the idea is it makes it easier, of course, if you have a populated template. You won't even be able to go into eData and look and see individual student records. You won't have access at all. So that's why that populated file. And the reason we say both the file and the export is important is because if something happens to your file, you will be able to go to the pair website and download an empty template. And then with that saved, backed up export, you could repopulate a new template with the same data. So having both really insulates you from a whoopsie that sometimes happens with your computer. So usually more often than not, when you're not prepared for it. And lastly on this page, and then we'll get to a question in the chat, eData closes close of business on July 15th. No data entry after this date is possible. Question inevitably is, what is close of business mean? Well, I'll leave that open to your interpretation, and that's because we don't actually flip the switch. IT does. So we're going to tell IT, flip the switch at the end of the day on the 15th. The end of their day may be 4 o'clock. The end of their day may be 3:30. I honestly am not going to speculate or even rely on their time because they have their schedule and they're very busy. So they're going to do it when they get to it. So I guess, really the takeaway here is while we can say close of business July 15th, which is a Monday, we would strongly recommend you get all of your data entry done the week before. Don't wait until Monday. Don't take the risk, because once it's done, it's done. And some things, if you encounter an error, require time to resolve. So that's the gist of that. To get back to a question in the chat, let me expand my chat window here so I could see it a little better. So Annette says, when must the data validation form be submitted to PDE? It's on the form. It's on the form. I'd have to look up when Steve is going through some items later. I'll see if I can put that in the chat. Oh, Lauren took care of it. Thank you, Lauren. I'm honestly a little bit apprehensive about saying deadlines when it comes to the division, since we're not the division and I don't want to say the wrong date and give you the wrong thing. But once you get the form, that should be there and you'll be all set. Thanks, Lauren. Second question says from Vicky, where do I copy a populated template file? So a populated template file would appear on your computer with the if you see what's called file extensions on your computer, it would be a .accdb file. So I say that because you have doc files and XLS files for Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel, respectively, with PDF files for Adobe PDF. So it's just another kind of file. When you have a populated template, you can copy that to any place on your computer. You don't have to save multiple copies per se, but what we're saying is just take a file, put it in the normal place that you do on your computer. Data folder is just fine. Populate it and just make sure it's there and stays there populated. Don't wait until after the 15th and say, oh, I can back up my data now that the year's over, because you won't be able to. So there's nothing really special here, Vicky, as far as where you put it or how you run the template. Same process and procedure as we always have pointed out and that the documentation online would help you with. If you haven't done it before, I think almost everybody in the room has done it before. Yes. So to confirm, you just put in /data. Yes, that's the best spot to put it on your computer. You can put a template file technically anywhere. But yeah, so that's a great question, because I think sometimes when we have discussions like this, it makes it seem like there's something new or fancy or different that we're asking you to do at the end of the year, and there really isn't. So I'm really glad you asked that question, because what we're saying is just make sure you have a template file, which may be saying the same thing as make sure you just update your file like you always do, and just do it before the 15th. That's really all we're saying, just so you have it. Okay, good questions. Good questions. Some reminders, just miscellaneous, if you will, reminders. Do not exit all of your adults in eData. There are appropriate ways to exit adults and mark them as exited, which when we say exit, that means put an exit date in their file. If the students that you are thinking about have been gone for more than 90 days when you check their student file, and there's a query in the template that says adults that have 0 instructional hours in XX days. So you can run that with 90 days as the setting. And when you run that, if you see students that are on that list that do not have an exit date, you may apply an exit date because they have essentially been gone long enough that even if they did come back, they would have a new period of participation. So an exit date in those cases is appropriate. So what we're saying is don't exit just everybody just because it's the end of the program year. So that's an important concept, because sometimes in the past, I'm not saying any of you would do this, but in the past, there's been a confusion saying, well, to be in a cohort for an outcome, one of the 4 core outcomes, the student has to have an exit date. Well, that is true, but having an exit date in eData does not necessarily qualify the outcome. It needs to be a legitimate, they've been gone for more than 90 days exit date, which the statistician independently verifies, independent from the exit date in eData. So the exit date for you is more information for you to use, entered in eData, so that you can accurately track the students that, should they return next year, in July in this case, they would be either continuing or returning. And we're not going to worry too much about that today, continuing returning. That's more of a beginning program year concept. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. But the idea is, just to summarize, don't exit all your adults, only apply exit dates where appropriate. A couple of the next items you see on here are just items that are really aligned with NRS reporting standards. So things that we as a state collectively want to make sure we're focused on so that we get it right when information is sent to the feds. And the first one is to check and update all your staff years of experience. That will change and evolve. So even as you use and put in staff years of experience, you want to update that to say, as of the start date for this year, how many years of experience did you have? So there's nothing special at the end of the year per se that we would be evolving or changing what you already entered. You just want to go back and just check, and you could run the staff query to see this in the first page of the template, just to see, run that staff button, front page of the template. It shows you everything about your staff. Just check those years of experience and make sure they're consistent with what they should be. Also, to the same idea, also can be done on the adult button in this case. In the main page of the template, you can check for correct county in adult records. So we want to make sure we point, and that's the county of residence for the adult. So whatever they gave you for street and things like that, that's the county of residence. Also review data checks in detail. We talked about that a little bit earlier. You'll get one from us, but you don't have to rely on our data check. You can and should run them in your local environment so that you can run them, find any issues that you have, and resolve the issues if they are issues in the first place, because sometimes data checks are just a case of Sarah came to your program, she took a pre-test, but she never took a post-test. So she'll come up on a data check adults missing post-test. But if Sarah is no longer in contact with your agency and you haven't had any success in tracking her down, that's not an issue that you can resolve. It's just how life sort of played out. But if she did take a post-test and it just never got entered into eData, that would be something you could resolve. That was a data entry misstep. That can be resolved. And that's where you'd run subsequent data checks after resolving several of those items, just to make sure that they resolved the check. But I would venture to guess none of you will have blank data checks by the end of this year. The goal is always to resolve as many as you can, but you will probably not have blank data checks because adult ed being what it is, there will just be things that happen with students that just don't fit in with what we're looking to resolve. And so what we would suggest in those cases is document in Sarah's file in that situation that she separated before. That way, if there's ever some kind of internal or external monitoring that you do with your data to make sure all loose ends get tied up, you'd have that little breadcrumb to come back to and say, oh yeah, we didn't put that in there. It was a data check unresolved item because she never returned to class. That'd be something to think about. So in the chat, there is a question from Laura. Does years of experience update at the end of the current year, at the beginning of the new year? What you would just want to make sure is that years of experience is up to date as of the 23-24 program year at the end of the year. Just make sure that that's up to date as of now. And that would be okay if you had, so we're dealing with years here. So when we're having years, it's kind of, you've got a pretty big window within which, and it's ranges too. So just check it and make sure that you're not, because if you have, and I actually don't even have it in front of me. I didn't come as prepared as I should have, but it's like 1 to 3 years, more than 3 years, something like less than 1 year. So if it's sitting at less than 1 year and you find somebody that's been in your agency for 5 years, then you certainly would want to update that. Those are the kind of things that you'll likely see real quick, which maybe just have not been updated or kept up to date. That's what we're looking for. We want to make sure those are up to date. And it's also because Laura, you said at the end of the year, or the beginning of the year, you really want to check it both and just keep it up to date. Any other questions on those items? The staff start date should roll over because it is in the staff details section. So if you are rolling over staff, this is a question in the chat from Vicky, related also to staff records. Staff start date should roll over because it is in the there's also a program year start date, or I think it's not program year, but rather agency start date down in the program year details section of staff records. That is different because one's adult ed start date, that's up in the details section. That should roll over. The agency start date, which is in the program year details section, will be blank at the beginning of every year. So you'd have to fill that in. And remember, adult ed start date is just what it sounds like. It could have been a different agency. That's why we have in the program year details section the agency start date, because that could be different. But both could be before this program year, which is what you would evaluate when determining 8 years of experience. So yes, the good news is, Vicki, if you make sure that's up to date now, when you roll those records over into next year, that adult ed start date should stay the same. You'll just have to re-enter the agency start date. Okay, let's keep going. So we'll still have some more items to think about. And these are some new for this year. So what you heard me just say about the staff, we started emphasizing that last year. Don't add all exit dates. You've heard that for years now. These items that you see on the screen are a little bit new, a little bit of a new emphasis we wanted to review with you. The first is to make sure to check all class record special program types for accuracy. As the other items we've mentioned with adults and staff and now classes, you can run the class report on the main screen of the Access template and just check that the special program types align with the classes. And those special program types, you can think of them as labels about what makes the class special. And for the most part, these days, that really encompasses how does the class function? Is it so for classes that don't have a very special program type, and I'll get to what I mean by that in a second, but for classes that meet routinely and would be math classes, ESL classes, and so on, you just want to make sure you put in the special program type, because that is the hybrid, the remote, the high flex, in person, and so on, all those different categories. The special ones, and I say it that way because they're more rare, would be your IET classes, your workplace, your fast track. Those are far less common, but possible. So you want to make sure that the special program type definitions align with those. And there's some information in the guidance from the division about what constitutes a HiFlex class, what is a hybrid class, and so on. So if there's something that's kind of in between, and you also have time, if you're not sure, to check in with your advisor. If you check all the definitions in the guidance and in the manual glossary and you're not sure, and you just have that one class, you're not sure how to categorize it, maybe it's 2 different things. Check with your advisor. This is why we're doing this now, a month before the system closes, so you have time to resolve some of those issues. But those special program types, important to check those, and important to check and add a reason for leaving to exited adult records. So in general, now we're talking about adult records, and in adult records on the adult details tab in eData, there is a program year details section. That's where put barriers to employment, put reason for attending, you put employment information, and so on. Generally speaking, that information stays the same unless someone is incarcerated and you have to put some incarceration data, or released from incarceration. That's another thing. The other item that you would want to update in that is when someone exits, to put in a reason for leaving. We are actually in the process of changing those, not drastically, just more or less better defining and organizing the options that are available. But for the options available this year, go in for your exited adults and put in the reason for leaving. That should also be, if I'm not mistaken, in the adult records for the adult button on the template. And then the last item I put on here was just situations with shared adults. And what that means is, if you have a shared adult, and when we say shared, of course, that means the adult that is in eData, you could see when you look at their record, shared with so-and-so, gives you an indication of the other agency. For those shared adults, you can, well, the biggest thing with shared adults is they share, they being the student, shares the assessments across all of the involved agencies. So if you run in any data checks or anything that has assessments and that individual is a shared student, there may be some items to either go back and resolve, whether it's tests that didn't get added things like that, or moving forward, if a student is currently enrolled in two different agencies. I don't believe that's real common. When we look at the shared adults, we can't always tell exactly we know who's shared as far as shared records, but it's sometimes not easy to tell who's being taught by, so to speak, two different agencies. So in those cases, you would possibly have the knowledge of that. And if you do, and you know that's occurring, you'd want to just make sure that you are coordinating any ongoing assessments with the shared agency. That's typically the biggest part with shared agency. And then any other updates like social security number updates, anything else that would impact reporting, you can and should coordinate with the shared agency, because those are the situations where you may need to resolve some data checks and you may need the help of the shared agency. Not common, but it does happen. And the best thing we offer for that is, as advice, is just to really just communicate with the other agency and just tie up any loose ends as needed. And that's true for all of the program year, but especially now, this time of year, the urgency just gets increased. Any questions on any of those items? I think we're caught up with questions in the chat, so just have to wait and see if there's any new ones. All right, seeing no questions, we'll go on to our last section of the day. This section is, I'll preface this whole section without even going through all the particulars with a scenario. So we're sitting here, MIS eData Tech Support. We get a phone call in October. And I'm probably sharing an experience that many of you have already had. We get a phone call in October and someone calls us and says, we noticed that so-and-so is missing an assessment, or we just started data entry and there's no rollover for an assessment that we thought would be there is missing. Or we ran a data check and we see that there's students missing pre-tests, whatever it may be. And come to find out that one or more students started the program year with that agency back in July. The agency thought that they had some assessments that they could roll over, but maybe the dates just didn't quite line up. And the rollover wasn't there. And they didn't assess the student within 30 days after their start date. So what ends up happening is in October, well after anything could be done about it, there are one or more students that ultimately don't have a pretest for the program year, and therefore, of course, can't be counted for enrollment or gain purposes. So that's something that I think we'd all agree probably we don't want to have happen. And in the interest of setting up some concepts and some ideas that we can all use potentially moving forward to prevent that, we wanted to specifically call out some planning for rolling over adult records, and in particular, the assessments that are associated with those records. So as you know, to set up the scenario further, assessments are not available to roll over in eData if they are more than 150 days old. So they have to be within 150 days. And the days calculation is from the date of the assessment to the start date, the period of participation start date of the following program year. Typically speaking, 150 days is roughly about, of course, 5 months. So to do a rough calculation, you can look at the students that have tested maybe say in February and know that if they tested February 15th, their assessment will expire, for the lack of a better word, on July 15th. So if it's late July that student then starts with your agency, they would need a new assessment to be able to have a valid pretest for the program year. We're going to actually share a query here shortly in the template to show you an example of how you can take a look at this and analyze and look for students that might fit this situation. A couple other bullets here before we get to that are, make sure you alternate assessment forms. And that's because, again, we're talking about scenarios where in July and August, you may not have the full information of the previous program year, but you can run reports in the template or in your local database just to see who took what assessment back in the spring. If you know that students that you're working with in July and August are going to be taking assessments, and you're going to want to also roll over assessments from the previous program year, you'll want to make sure that whatever assessments you administer in July and August alternate forms. So really, we're talking about things that you're already expected to monitor these things during the program year. It's just that when we have a data system like eData that closes at the end of one year and reopens with blank sheets, and you have to start from scratch each program year, these concepts get a little more tricky because it's just easy to kind of lose track of things when they're not there and you're starting from scratch and you don't have access to eData until the end of August. So that's really what we're talking about. So just like earlier when we talked about those ideas of backing things up, it's really the same thing you're doing through the year. It's just a greater emphasis now. It's the same thing with the planning for the rollover assessments. You're just entering into a 2-month period, maybe even 3 months if we include some of September, where you may not have access to eData, to your access reports. So you're flying blind a bit. And that's where preparing now and saving and getting ready now is really important. And that leads to our suggestion here to create lists for rollover assessments or lack thereof, meaning folks that may be post-tested in January, because no January assessment will be available for rollover in the next program year. It's always going to be more than 150 days. And so we're going to share here in a moment how to monitor for some of that. And this is just one idea. There are several, but just one idea. Annette says, can you remind us who should be given a start date of July 1, even if they start after July 1? So the idea with that, Annette, is there's a concept in eData. Well, there's a concept that is periods of participation. You all know that now. That is an uninterrupted, no more than 90-day interruption period of time where the student has instructional hours. So if they're always attending and they never have a more than 90-day gap of instructional hours, they're on a continuous period of participation. Once they have a greater than 90-day gap, but then they return, then they have a new period of participation. You all know that because if during the program year that happens, someone starts in October and then comes back in April, you give them an exit date in October and a new start date in April, new period of participation. Well, that same concept doesn't change or stop when we go and cross program years. So the idea with the start date of July 1 is if someone is continuously attending your program now, let's just use the example of 23-24 program year, and they return, let's say July 15th, because if you're a community college, for example, you may have ended classes on June 15th and start new classes July 15th. Well, the date of first instruction is July 15th, but the student never stopped attending. So they're what's considered a continuing student. So that would be July 1. If they are a returning student, then they would be getting a start date that is in line with their date of first instruction. So that's a concept that's a little bit tricky. We cover that more in detail in the fall. And there'll be some on there every year we put out a document. This year we're going to put it in the manual glossary. That's a starter program year guide that reviews that concept in detail. And what I would say is for these assessments, the assessments are on their own timeline, which many times is a timeline that you have to consider in addition to the 90 days of period of participation. So when we talk about what start date a student has, that's one set of criteria. And then the assessments and whether or not the rollovers would work, that's another set of criteria. So I'm going to set aside now, after answering that question, the whole period of participation and start date for the student question, and just return now to the idea of assessments that are only valid within 150 days. So Steve, if you want to take over the share,
Sure.
and put on the screen. What Steve and I did was talk about how could an agency monitor what we're saying here on the screen. So I'm going to stop my share and let Steve kind of take over for a minute. And when he does, he's going to show us a report in the template. And what we're doing here is this is the scrub database. So this just has, it has real data, real numbers, but the names and everybody in here are bogus. We just
Are you
scrub
seeing
that
my
out.
screen?
Yes, Steve, looks good.
Okay, so this is a scrubbed single agency sample. We've got 620 adults in this sample. We're going to go to the assessments page, which has the second from the bottom one is the most recent assessment date query. This query has a field called the most recent assessment date, which gives you a record for every single student in your agency. You can see down here we have 620 rows with the most recent assessment date in this column. So if you wanted to get, say, a snapshot or a snip of a section of this to really focus in, you can go to the little down pointing triangle here at the end of this field, and you can pick, because it's a date field, you can either go through this exhaustive list of every single assessment date, or you can go to the date filters, which has all sorts of choices here. I'm going to take you to, if you go to the bottom one, all dates in period, gives you another whole list of things. And we're going to take an example of February, because if you have tested in February, like Michael said, you could be rolled over in July and use it as a pretest. So if we picked February, what it did was it sorted this list down to 86 students now. And I haven't sorted it, so it might be a little confusing. So let's just sort this. Let's sort the oldest to the newest just to see what's going on. Notice right at the top here, we have some that appear to be out of whack, but actually, if you look at the year, these are 23. So these top 8 students were actually rolled over from the previous year. So we're going to ignore those. There's a couple of ways you can ignore them. You can either, you could send this out to you could export external data. You could go out to Excel, and then you could just remove those rows. Or in the drop down, you can see that they're actually selected here, and you can deselect them if you don't want to see them in your exact query right here. Now we have only February of 2024, and they are sorted from the 1st of February. So these that were tested on the 1st of February, right around the 1st of July, they're going to need to be put in your system if they need a rollover, and then you'll have 30 days to post-test them from there. But you can see how simple it is to create this subset of, in this case, 78 students that are sort of a high priority to be looked at when you get into July and looking at who needs a test. It also tells you the number of hours since their assessment. Some of these maybe, like this one at 82, should possibly be tested before the end of the program year. Of course, we still have a few weeks left, so this could be used. It can also be used for those kinds of things as well. And you could limit this selection, and in this date query, you could go to any month. As you saw, I picked February, but we could do the same thing for March. And then we could send it out to, and note again, we have the 23s in here. So we can get rid of the 23s from our selection. There's only 6 of them this time. And then we have just the March of 24s, and you can send that out to a spreadsheet and then have it readily available to review. Did I miss anything, Michael?
No, I think that was perfect as an overview. And to add to what you just said, Steve, what you could consider a couple things. This is one method of many. given the data sheets allow the flexibility to sort and filter as you see Steve doing, and also given that we have multiple reports and queries available, some of you listening may already have a procedure that you use. So there's no requirement that you do it this way. We'll do whatever way it works for you. But just to kind of piggyback on what Steve was demonstrating here with, let's take March as an example since it's on the screen. The idea of separating these folks out and having them ready is to say that as of August, again, as a rough calculation, these folks will likely not have a valid pretest if, for example, the student that has March 1st at the top of the screen, if she comes back and her start date ends up being August 5th, that assessment will not be available for rollover. There are a couple date calculator web-based tools that you could do. You just do date between calculator in Google, and you'll get up to a website. You could put in 2 dates and it'll tell you exactly how many, because of course it varies if the year has, like we did this year, is a leap year. So you get a bonus, you get a +1, which actually kind of works against us because it adds a day in between to the expiration interval. But in any case, I'm hoping that this is helpful to all of you, just if you're thinking of ways to analyze and maybe be prepared. Because right now, it's not so much the post-testing that needs to be done. That's still, we're not saying to post-test all students right now just so they have rollovers. What we're saying is within the valid and appropriate post-testing routine, you can use, and once that's complete for the year, you can then run a report like this once all of your data is in and look back and say, when we appropriately post-tested the student, it was back in, let's say, April. And April will take us to roughly September. And the idea is you know that, but you don't know who. And you don't know necessarily which test specifically. So a query like this tells you who, when, and what test. And it filters it down right off the bat when you click the button to 1 test per person. And that was the most recent test. As always, with assessments, please do follow policy and all that timing. That's very important. But the idea here is that this will give you a watch list, so to speak. That's really ultimately what we're encouraging and sharing, is the idea of creating a watch list where when you have and you're reviewing attendance sheets, which you could do in June, or excuse me, in July and August, when you're maybe monitoring class rosters, you're monitoring who's participated in various orientations. You can use a list like this to say, oh, look, I see that person was March 1st. That looks like that might not be a valid test. And then not valid test, but not available for a rollover. And then combine that with all of your other assessment procedures to ensure that you don't miss somebody who should have been tested. That's really the big takeaway here. Finding those folks that should be post-tested, or in the case of a new program, you're pre-tested. It's hard to use those terms, kind of we're using them interchangeably because of the timing across program years. But hopefully that is a helpful process, because we're just trying to reduce or eliminate those October moments of frustration where in lieu of a time machine, you just can't take any action. It's too late. And Corinne's adding a comment, and it says, end of year lifesaver, and having the assessment scores added to it has made it even useful. Well, thank you, Corinne, for that. And then Allison says, if you are an agency with multiple subgrantees, can you sort by agency? Yes, you absolutely can. So the example that Steve shared was a scrubbed single agency example. But if there were multiple agencies, you can either filter them out the same way Steve filtered out those dates that he didn't want from 2023. Same exact process with removing agencies from the list, or you can just sort them so that you can produce a report. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Steve, that report, when you click on the button, it provides all the agency information and all the students within each agency, and it's sorted by agency. So it should be alphabetically sorted by agency, then by student in the agency, and their name is alphabetical by last name, and then the assessment info. So only when you start filtering and sorting dates will you see some of those things change. But yes, you can combine sorts and filters across multiple fields, including the grantee fields.
And if you need help, just call us.
Yes. Yes. So that was a lot. We have a few more minutes of your time. We can take maybe another question or two before we part ways. But again, as to Steve's point, we'll be available. We've got a month for this. And, the idea here is if you have the takeaway, and what we'll emphasize is the catch-all. Everything's important, but the catch-all for being prepared is if you have a copy of your template populated and you're able to run these kind of reports, you'll be able to monitor things when the new year starts, monitor things that you want to monitor, including things like the assessment that we just covered. So I think we'll have time for one more question. Jackie says, does the students' hours that are carrying over from the last post-test in 3-4 translate towards, in this case, she's saying it's a 40+ hour post-test cutoff, into the 24/5 if they will be using a new test? Oh, Jackie, I wish I could answer that, but I actually don't know the answer. I think that sounds like the perfect perfect advisor question, because either advisor or if the publisher put anything to that end in their publisher guidance from transitioning. It sounds like if you're going from CASAS work and life being replaced by steps, I wonder if the steps publisher's recommendations has anything about that. I don't have that documentation, so I don't know. If it does, of course, you'd be all set. You can follow the publisher's guidance. But if it does, or if it doesn't, or if it doesn't, or if it does and you're not sure, that would be a good advisor question. Because it might be also helpful for the advisors to know that there's some questions in the field like that. And if necessary and appropriate, they could maybe provide some guidance to everybody along those lines. That's a great question. All right. So what I would say is Steve and I unfortunately have to get right to another meeting back to back with this one. So we're going to have to let you all go, but I'm glad we had a chance to chat. This recording will be made available at a later time. We'll provide an announcement of that via our listserv and also with the template. So we'll let you go now to get back to your things and get to our things. But as Steve already alluded to, when you have questions, please feel free to reach out. We can do quick Zoom meetings. We can do all kinds of stuff to support you through this. And hopefully we'll chat soon. Take care. Have a great rest of the week. Stay cool. All right. So I'm going to shut things down. Everybody be well. Take care.